All right. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the conversation on allyship from the perspective of an organizer. My name is Keesha Gaskins-Nathan, and I'm the director of the Democratic Practice Program for the United States with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. I am thrilled to be joined for this really important conversation with Lidya Woldeyesus, who's a lead ambassador from Tufts, and Garfinkle, I said it wrong already. I'm sorry. Plymesser. Plymesser, thank you so much. Who's a lead ambassador from the University of Louisville. So welcome. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'd love to start out by understanding really quickly what brought you to this conversation around talking about allyship and organizing, and a little bit about your background so we can all orient to like where you're coming from for this discussion. Lidya, why don't you kick us off?
Hi, all. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So I'd say I'm originally from DC. I'd say my background and what brought me to today is my organizing work with Black Lives Matter DC, where we push during my high school years for transparency between MPD and residents. We were able to pass legislation creating a database for police accountability measures, for creating a civilian review board, things of those nature. And on campus now, I work on a defunding campus police effort.
Right on. Thank you so much. Wynn, tell us about your background and what brings you to this conversation.
Yeah, so I'd also love to thank everyone here and thank AGF for hosting NCLTS. It's such an amazing summit, and I'm so excited to be a part of it again this year. My background as an organizer pretty much started with Vote Everywhere. It's been a huge part of my life for the past year and this year as well. With voting rights and making sure that everyone has their voice heard and advocating for those whose voices aren't always listened to. I think that that's a big part of my life now, is advocating for voting rights and just advocating for anyone who needs help or anything like that. I also do work with Band Conversion Therapy Kentucky, which is a huge part of my work in Kentucky. So yeah.
Right on. Thank you both. Wynn, I'd love for you to take like 2 minutes and tell us from your orientation, what does allyship mean to you, right? I think one of the things that we kind of have a thing that people are like, I'm an ally, right? And, in my experience, allyship is really much more of an orientation. It's an orientation to the world. It's a series of actions. It's action and activity, not just like, you can't wear it like a shield or a badge. And so as you do it or as you think about allyship in the context of organizing, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, so I agree with you entirely that allyship is an action. It's an active word. It's not a passive word. It's not a thought process of just, I think I'm an ally and I have allied thoughts, so I'm doing the work and I'm an ally. And I don't think that ally is necessarily a word that you get to give to yourself. I think that it's something that those who you're being an ally to are there to, I guess, judge and kind of say, are you really doing the work? Or are you being performative? Which is a huge issue that I think we'll get into more in this talk. But to me, allyship is just really making sure that everyone is being advocated for. As a queer Jewish woman, it's super important to me that others are advocating for me when I need that help and when I need that allyship. And so I just see it as kind of my responsibility and my duty as just a human to therefore give my privilege to advocating for others in the spaces that I can. And I'll never understand the oppression and racism that Black, Indigenous, people of color face. But what I can do is use my voice and give them their space as well and make sure that I'm uplifting. I think that that is such a huge part of allyship, is uplifting voices that aren't always uplifted in our society.
Right on. Lidya, what does allyship mean to you, and how do you recognize it when you see it in the world?
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective of allyship being an orientation to the world. I think when I think about allyship, I think about positional power and how you are leveraging it in as your orientation changes, and as the communities that you're in, as the societal situations that you're in change. And it's also a conversation about privilege. There is, as a Black woman, there are, I'll say this, in my organizing work, I'm looking to white people to be allies to the movement. And that means a number of things. Like Wynn said, we're going to be going into this, but that's showing up, listening, giving space and making space for those in the movement whose voices are never being heard, and using their positional power to use their voices, because they're the ones that are listened to and respected and uplifted and honored and valued in this world. But there are also times where I have immense privilege and positional power to advocate for others. I'm at a private university where I am receiving, first my family to go to college. I'm able to receive an education where so many people back home do not have that opportunity. And so it's also my responsibility in a situation like that to be using my privilege and to be advocating and using my positional power in those cases.
So you said something, Lidya, I think that was important. You talked a little bit about responsibility in the context of allyship. And there are some real challenges. I think one of the big things that we see with allyship is oftentimes people are coming from a place of guilt or shame, which is really different than coming from a place of responsibility and community. And these are really different distinctions, but we find people in trying to do their best, really oftentimes conflating the few, becoming really difficult. And one of the really big, hard questions I always have to ask myself is the tension between how much grace should be given for people who are clearly trying, but how much should we be pushing people to be like, look, I understand what you're trying to do, but this is woefully unsuccessful. So how do we speak to that in that framework? And so I'm going to ask Wynn to go first. We're going to switch up the next time. I'm going to ask Wynn to give us 2 minutes on responsibility, community, guilt, and shame. How do we deal with the tension, and what's our responsibility to respond? Grace versus step it up.
Yeah, I think it's a hard conversation, and it's something that a lot of people have been having this conversation for a long time, but some people are just getting into it right now. So I think that it's important to give grace, and when people are genuinely trying their best to educate themselves with the resources they have. And the truth is, we all have pretty much the same resources with Google. That's something that I'm like, we can
we all have access to Google and these kinds of things. There's real digital divides and these kinds of things. I'll leave it alone, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I just mean with asking people to educate them, like, I'm not going to go and ask a Black woman to educate me. I can, take a second to educate myself. And I think that a lot of white allies are having that conversation of not asking other people to educate us. We can take that responsibility and educate ourselves first,
Do you see it then as your responsibility? Like, where's your role as an ally when you see other people that are well-meaning? How do you assist in contextualizing that? So the burden isn't always on people of color, women of color, and other allies to push in that space. So how do you push in that space where someone else may be oriented in a place where they are forced to give grace, where you have the opportunity to push? Have you done that? Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, I think my main examples right now are a lot of digital examples because of the time we're living in and living in a pandemic. I've been self-isolating, so I haven't been out. So I've been doing a lot of organizing and allyship online, I think, and seeing just things on social media. I think it's my responsibility to, when I see something that's problematic or someone's well-meaning, but it didn't work out or it didn't really have the effect that they were going for, I have taken my time to respond or DM or anything like that to make sure that they understand kind of what the issue with that was. I think like a big issue that happened was the black squares on Instagram is something that I found a really big problem with because it was ridiculous. I mean, a lot of white people just put, and other people did as well, but white people posting a black square with hashtag Black Lives Matter when that just drowned out all the informative information on the Black Lives Matter hashtag, and also with Instagram's algorithm that just, those black squares were coming up on my feed for days and days at a time. I just think it was one of those things that was super performative of, oh, I'm going to post this, and like, have they posted anything since that black square? I don't think so. So on that day, that Tuesday, I was like commenting on, I think my comments on Instagram got disabled because I was just commenting, hey, this is actually super regressive to the movement and not helping anything online. And I think that with the digital capacities that we have at our hands, we have to use them really wisely. So I think that was just a really big problem that happened. And yeah, that was, I think, just using my voice in those spaces to take the burden off of others, whether that's through comments or DMs, like I said, in this digital age.
Thank you so much, Wynn. Lidya, I'm going to take a little bit of personal privilege here. As a Black queer woman, I find myself constantly in this space of like, how much grace, how much do I push? And it depends on the environment, it depends on the context, but how do you deal with this in an organizing context? When you're leading, when you're following, but as an organizer, this must be a challenge that comes up for you all the time. How do you think about it?
Yeah, it's something that I go back and forth on, and I think has changed over the years for me. In this moment, I have no patience for it. I have no patience to educate or to to extend grace, because I feel like at this point, it's enough. I'm one of those people where I wrote this piece for my political science newsletter, talking about like kind of like the recent like the recent protests and things like that came out of the murder of George Floyd, and I just kept asking the question, where have you been? Because this spiritual, like this new awakening of like racism and white supremacy and capitalism has been something that just is like has truly upset me and frustrated me, and like made me want to pull my hair out of my head. I wanted to read a quote from Audre Lorde from Sister Outsider Essays and Speeches, and she says, Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. There's a constant drain of energy, which might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future.
I think that's really important. Like, I mean, first of all, I love Audre Lorde, so like, yeah. I keep the quotes around, but I think the one thing was the idea of saying, how much energy are we supposed to continue to put forth in this space, and how much should we be able to count on allies and allies in this space to be able to say, look, you know, this is it, this is enough, or I'm just not going to be there in this way. And how does that change, and how does that matter to you? So when we think about actual examples of allyship, right, I think we've seen some really interesting things in the news. And I won't comment on how much they were sort of elevated for different kinds of reasons, but certainly the wall of white women in Kentucky, the wall of moms in Portland, the dads with the leaf blowers in Portland. Some of the ideas of people not just saying we're here, but just also saying like we're here, we're forward, we're physically using our privilege to stand between you and people that we know want to hurt you, and risking themselves. That is certainly a clear example of allyship. I think it says something very specific. It does something very specific. In your experience, what are the best examples of allyship? And we can say best or worse. Like what is an example of like, this really is an allyship? And let's think about that. And we can pull that apart a little bit. Or what are the best examples of allyship, right? Like what are the examples of allyship that you have that you're like, I really appreciated this, or when I saw this, it really held up an example for me. And Lidya, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with, I'll start with best examples of allyship. I think the example that you just mentioned is a good one. Talking about like physically demonstrating that. I've seen like also other images of people at protests where there'll be police like infringing on like a line of protesters, mostly Black people, and like seeing white people step up and like go in front of them with their hands up with their military style weapons. And I think that's one example. I'm thinking about in the times that I've seen it in my time at Tufts has been folks using their voice in classes when it's like students are saying like messed up things or saying wrong things or just using their voice to call out when things are not okay. And I always appreciate that because it's taking off the energy and the burden off of me. And so I think that's the way that I like to view like good examples of allyship. It's like, are you relieving the burden off of the marginalized? And are you doing it without expecting any accolades? And are you doing it without expecting, comments to be had afterwards? Like that, it should just be a given, and you should be doing that, and it's an active process. As for worst, I hate performative activism. And I think the place where I see it most is on social media. So like people posting things and posting threads or like, just reposting things. I've seen like so many pictures of people holding up posters at protests or taking pictures at protests where it's like you're showing the faces of people. And like if Ferguson was ever an example or Baltimore was ever an example, like folks were arrested after the fact because of images that circulated on the internet. I would say that that's probably one of the worst examples of allyship I see.
I'm always surprised when my wife and I talk about that a lot. They're like, why are people posting pictures of other people protesting with their full-on faces or these other things and not really acknowledging the risk and threat they're actually creating through their engagement, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm going to ask you sort of the same question, and really kind of like where have you seen the best examples that you've said, this is something I want to live up to?
Yeah, I think that for me, the seeing white people use their bodies as their allyship at protests has definitely been a really profound example for me. During, like I said, I've been self-isolating, so I haven't been at any of the protests because I live with someone who's high risk, and I myself am high risk during the pandemic. So, but as a future kind of thing, looking to the future, hopefully the pandemic ends sometime soon. That's kind of crazy. Don't want to talk about that, but just seeing that, I think that was something, and seeing a lot of Black organizers in Kentucky and in Louisville, which is where I'm from and where a lot of protests have been happening, seeing Black organizers say, this is what we need from white people. We don't need you spray painting the buildings. We don't need you breaking windows, which is what we've seen videos of a lot of white people doing, which is very problematic. But rather the organizers saying, we need you to be a body and be there for safety of Black people. We don't need you there for your pictures. We don't need you there to post on Snapchat or anything like that, which is also, you know, causing harm to people's safety. So yeah, I think that has definitely been a really good way of being an ally. Yeah.
Wonderful. So you guys are organizers. So I'm going to ask you to bring it down just one more level. When we talk about allyship in your work, in the people, when you sit in a room and you're making a plan and you're helping stuff out, like, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean to have allies in the space where you're working and operating? What does it mean? Like, is it just like an expectation? Is it part of your actual organizing plan? Do you leverage privilege as part of that plan? Like, are you saying, look, if it's a physical protest, we want these people out front first? This, that, and you're like, how are you, what does allyship mean in the process of organizing and the nuts and bolts of the work that you do? How are you expecting allies to step up? How are you asking people to step up? Like, what does it mean in the process? So Lidya, I'll go to you first.
With my work at MBLM DC, it was explicit. It was saying that if you are going to work with our organization, this is what we're outlining for you. And if you're not willing to operate under these guidelines or expectations, then we don't want you. Like that, like, is very explicit in that way, because it was important for us to say, like, we are the ones that are shaping this movement. And so we're not going to have white people co-opt the movement and say, and make their own, and try to speak on behalf of us without our consent. So that was explicit. And we had like trainings of like, we would like simulate protests or like high risk situations and what white people would need to do in those types of situations, what they would need to say, and like even how they could even have a conversation with an officer, because they'd be more like willing to do that. In my work at Tufts with defunding our campus police, we have had like several campaigns right now in terms of like trying to put pressure onto the administration. And we've been having white and wealthy students pushing for it, because those are the students that the university is worried about. They're worried about them making the noise because they're contributing the most to the school. And if they're making noise, then the trustees are going to hear about it. They're scared about their parents making like complaints, pulling, or that getting broadcasted in the media, things of that sort. So I think it goes back to probably my first point of like positional power.
So when you spoke about two things at different points, but I'm going to try and pull some threads. You talked about the voting rights work that you're really into and the fact that most of your work, due to the moment in time, right, the pandemic, has been super digital and been really dependent upon your digital presence being able to move in those spaces. And so how have you seen, either through voting rights or in the digital space or both, that you've been able to say, like, this is how allyship shows up as we're making plans, as we're engaging? How does it look different, like with messaging or other pieces where it may look, obviously it's not the same as being like, how are you showing up like physically in space? But what does it mean in a digital context?
Yeah, I think a big part of allyship in a digital context is time, and taking time, which is a huge thing with service as well, is giving your time to the cause or different causes. So with voting rights, I think that I've also been doing some work in Ohio, because there's I live in Cincinnati not during the school year, so during the summer. And there's a bill right now to stifle absentee voting, and it's awful. So I think a main thing, what I'm trying to say with time, is dedicating your time and giving your time for doing what you can from home, which is calling your senators, calling your House members, calling people, and having that way of having your voice heard and standing up for what the bills are trying to, go against. And that's a main thing that I've been doing with being at home, has been taking my time to and if people are uncomfortable making actual phone calls, you can write emails, write letters, all of that good stuff. So yeah, I think that that's been a huge part, is just making sure that you're dedicating time to something that's not only going to affect you, but affect others who will have been marginalized.
So one of the challenges that we also often see is, like, is it people defining themselves as allies in a way because of their personal orientation to the world. I believe in this, I believe in that, and trying to draw the line between that's just being a decent person, right? Just acting like a decent person and respecting the humanity of others doesn't quite put you into the allyship place. It just makes you not bad person. How do we start elevating these ideas in ways that they can be heard, right? Because naming and shaming is actually not an inclusive way of communicating. It may oftentimes be how I feel. It may oftentimes be in a moment, like, again, how much grace can I give? But I also know that over time, when we're dealing on large scale groups of people, you guys are constantly communicating, one to many is your communication style, and as you have to as organizers. What do you think the best ways to communicate, that allyship is about, is an action, that it's listening, that it's learning, that it's yielding space? Where does that come from in how we do our everyday existence, separate and apart from, like, when we're organizing to hold signs or we're actively calling legislators? And I'll go to you first. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by, like, shaming, not naming?
What I'm saying is that we talked about it a little bit, the idea that allyship doesn't come from a place of shame or guilt, that it's actually from responsibility and community. And if someone comes in and they're kind of a little off, or their message is a little muddled, or we're just trying to say this is what allyship looks like, sometimes it can be like, that's not it, you're not right, this, that, and the other. And that's not necessarily, from a communication standpoint, that's not always the best way to get allegiance around an orientation or a narrative. So how do we talk about allyship even when we're exhausted? How do we talk about allyship in this way that says, if you're ready to be an ally, we're ready to bring it. That doesn't mean we have to be the ones doing the work. But what does that look like on, like, as an operational matter, as a narrative matter?
Yeah, I haven't. I think for my organizing work on campus at the University of Louisville with Vote Everywhere mainly, it has been about accessibility and making sure that our message is accessible to everyone, which means that it's posted a lot around campus, but also that we're posting our message in different languages and things like that. But then also, sorry, this is kind of a hard question.
It is a hard question. It is a hard question, but I mean, I think it's a real question that we have to really push ourselves on, is we can't just run around being like, that's not it, that's not it. But we do acknowledge, what does that look like? How do we be that space that welcomes people to it and allows people to grow within it? Right? Without, embracing the enemy, right? We don't have to continue to exhaust ourselves. As women, as queer women, as women of color, we've always done the heavy lift. As groups, we've always been the one who have put our backs into it. And looking to say, if you're going to be a real ally, it's absolutely reasonable to expand that space and be like, if this is going to be real, we all have to do a bigger lift. How do we say that in a positive way on a regular basis that makes all of this movement work, the cross-cultural inclusive messaging work that has to be for Black lives to really matter, for queer rights to be meaningful, so we can seek and actually achieve the liberation that this work is designed to achieve? So Lidya, I'll give you, tell me how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I'm thinking about two trains of thoughts here. The first is white supremacy is a part of every single institution. So I know earlier we were talking about grace, and I think this will be the moment where this is the place where I exercise grace, because we have been educated in so many different systems that is just entrenched in white supremacy, right? And so there's so much, we're talking about allyship is learning, but it's also unlearning so many of the things that you have been taught over the course of your life. And then my second train of thought is intent versus impact, and how you're perpetuating harm. So if your intention is great and it is just simply a situation, a problem of misinformation or unlearning that needs to happen, then I feel like there's work that I can help you do. There's a collaborative effort that can be done, because you are trying and you are aware that I'm aware that there is so much that has impacted and influenced the way that you think, right? And that's whether the white supremacy has influenced each and every one of us, right? So that's not, I've gotten the same education as my white counterpart in K through 12 education, in terms of curriculum. So that's something I keep in mind all the time. And then your impact has to be acknowledged. And I think sometimes in this work, allies forget the power of an apology and how to apologize without saying, but I didn't mean it, but I didn't know, all these things, right? But the apology and experiences that I've had with bad examples of bad allyship, a good apology has gone a long way.
That's fair, right? I did it, and I'm sorry.
Yeah. Wow.
That's it. Stop there. And that's hard. That's hard to do, right? But so when one of the things I frequently think about, or an example that I will sometimes give, is there was one time I intended to make a really great pie, and I accidentally screwed up in the crust and made it with salt instead of sugar. And man, that pie looked great, but it was completely inedible. And what I feel like with impact versus intention is, when you're acting out of intention, you're expecting me to eat that salty pie, right? You aren't paying any attention to what actually it looks good, it looks great, it looks like something else I should be consuming, it looks like all these things. Why are you complaining? It looks the way it's supposed to look. I intended it to be a certain way. And, other people are looking at me like, I can't eat this. This is unreasonable for you to expect this of me. It actually tastes terrible, and I can't swallow it. And so when we think about allyship around intention, where have you experienced that in queer spaces where you're look, no more? How has that been something that's been a part of your experience on both sides? And do you feel like having experienced it more than one way helps you be a better ally in spaces where you have positional privilege?
Yeah. I'm so sorry. Could you repeat that? I just had the biggest
It's totally fine. I had the world's longest and unnecessary metaphor.
No,
I be edited. But the point of my question is, queerness brings its own challenges, right? That to the point where some people think LGBTQIA, the A stands for ally. It doesn't. And how have you experienced good and bad allyship in the queer space, and how has that informed your entering allyship in other places where you have more positional power?
Yeah, so luckily in the queer advocacy that I've done with Band Conversion Therapy Kentucky, it's really been a lot of good allyship that I've experienced. I haven't really had any super negative examples, but I think that's because the umbrella of Band Conversion Therapy Kentucky is going to bring really great people to come help and do our work. Like, I think that's also a problem, is like, or not a problem, but in activist spaces, like, we're getting all of these people who are like-minded, which is great, but it's reaching out to those other people who aren't, just might be a little shy to join those activist spaces and things like that. But I think just a lot of my work in the queer community has been people stepping up, and with Band Conversion Therapy Kentucky, it's a lot of legislative work, again, like I was talking about. So just stepping up and using your voice in that space that you have, where people are gonna, or where your legislators are probably gonna listen to them more than others. And I think that that translates to other fights and other causes of, like Lidya was talking about, you know, using your positional power to step in, and if a police officer is gonna listen to me more, or have a conversation with me, making sure that I'm putting myself in that space. And I think it's a lot about putting ourselves in uncomfortable spaces. Allyship isn't comfortable. It isn't, it doesn't always come easy. And that's something that I've been working on a lot, is putting myself into uncomfortable situations where I can better the outcome if I'm there, and where I can better uplift voices and things like that.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to ask you, so I'm going to ask you to start thinking about, what is your wrap-up point? Like, what do you really want us to walk away with this? And I'm going to go back to Lydia's point about white supremacy, right? A fish in water doesn't know it's wet, right? We are so deeply embedded in white supremacy as a framework and a paradigm where all of our other systems operate from. How do we get there? How do we as activists, and I use we loosely when I say activists, I can say me as an activist 20 years ago, me as a supporter today. What does it mean when you're active and actively engaging in spaces and constantly having to challenge your own ideas? And how do you orient yourself with your thinking when you're like, where am I on this? Or the first time you're confronted with something, you're like, I had this down, and now I'm confronting my own privilege. Where do you have to deal with when you're like, this is part of how I've defined myself or my identity, and now I've got my own demons, my own privilege? How do you confront that? How does that feel inside your body? And how are you able to bring that to either be a better ally or be more patient with folks? So I'm interested in sort of those moments that we all have when we're confronted by experiences and feelings that we thought we've dealt with, but now we're doing something new. We're growing into new spaces. So Wen, I'll go to you first, and then Lidya.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to this. So kind of, I guess, a little backstory. As a Jewish person, police are always in our synagogue, and I've always viewed them as like this safety, because as we've seen, anti-Semitism is on the rise, and where mass shootings have happened during Jewish high holy days and things like that. So yeah, I just grew up as seeing police, and like, they welcome us into temple, and it's a super, I would always smile at police and everything. And then with these past few years, it's really challenged me of that police as an institution are not good. And that's something that's been really hard, was really hard to unlearn. And I think that's what's so important. And Lidya brought that up, of unlearning these white supremacist ideas that have been ingrained in us. And I mean, it's still really hard for me to I'm still unlearning and coming to terms with, because when I see a police officer at my synagogue, I do still feel safe, but I have to understand that for so many others, seeing a police officer immediately means that they're unsafe. And I think it's unlearning things like that and being uncomfortable and dealing with that is so important as an ally or as an activist or whatever title you want to use.
Right on. Thank you. So Lidya, I'm going to ask you, what does it mean to step in these hard places, to confront your own ideas of not only who you are, but how you engage with the world? And how do you deal that with your own stuff when it's time for you to be an ally?
Yeah, and I think this is part of my wrap-up point of, I think you have to really dig your heels into it, because that's the only way to learn. And I surround myself with people that I can learn from. So I have many circles and I think that it's cool that I operate in a lot of circles where I'm learning from others and they're learning from me in different respects. I guess maybe an example for me, I'm thinking about my like unlearning and like understanding my personal belief that capitalism is not a productive mode of production. And coming to college, like I said, I'm the first in my family to go to college, and I was like, what do you mean the American dream isn't real? Look at me. I'm at college. Here I am on a full ride, and I am going to change the world. And like, this is what my parents worked so hard for. But learning actually about white supremacy, learning about how our economic system actually elevates the rich and demonizes the poor, wasn't an uncomfortable feeling. And then I have to come home and tell my parents, like, yeah, the American dream is not real. It was something uncomfortable to sit in, but I think I've learned so much from that, and I'm definitely operating in a completely different mode of thinking now. I think the advice here is to dig your heels into it.
I think that's great. One of the things I always say is, like, my comfort zone's a beautiful place, but nothing ever grows there. You've got to get out of that space and make life a little bit hard if you're gonna get to a better next place. And so I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Lidya. Wynn, I'm throwing it back to you to take us home. What do you think is the most important thing from either these ideas or something we didn't even get to around allyship, around organizing, and how you think about that in the work that you do in the world?
Yeah, I just think it's really important to, in every space that you're in, uplift other voices that aren't always heard, which means uplifting Black voices, uplifting Indigenous voices, uplifting people of color. And if that means that you get less airtime, that you get less time at the microphone, that's okay. It's okay to listen, to sit in your seat and learn from others. And I think that that's something that I do and that I'm continuing to do every day, is just learn from others, and do what I can. That's something I think that doing what you can, doing your best, giving yourself a little time to learn is important. And like I've said a lot, just putting yourself in those uncomfortable uncomfortable ideas, uncomfortable thoughts of unlearning what we have had ingrained into us since we were children, and just continuing to do your best in uplifting others.
Right on. I want to thank you both. I want to thank the Andrew Goodman Foundation for this opportunity to talk about this important topic. And I really want to honor y'all's experiences and your willingness to share that with everyone here today. Your work is incredibly important. What you've done is important. What you're going to do is amazing. And so I feel really honored to be in conversation with you here today. Thank you both so much. And I hope everyone has a good time with the rest of the conference. Thanks so much. Bye.